Hello, everyone. I'm Drew Curtis. It's an honor and pleasure to present some work I've been doing with Chris Hart on pathological liars to you all here at Decepticon. So pathological lying is in the common vernacular, and it's commonplace to a lot of people, yet it's not formally recognized as a psychiatric disorder in the DSM-5 and the ICD or in the major nosological classification systems. In fact, a deep dive into history, it has many different names. 1868, it's referenced by Wharton in legal documents deemed pseudomania. G. Stanley Hall, the American psychologist, talks about children's lies, pathological lies, and pseudomania. French psychiatrist Dupree in 1905 references mythomania. Delbrook in 1891 talks about pseudologia fantastica. And then some of the core individuals who developed classification systems of psychopathology, like Emil Kraepelin, Carl Jaspers, referred to this condition as morbid lying or even pathological lying. And then the zeitgeist appeared to shift. So these founding individuals in psychiatry and clinical psychology had referenced and noted within case studies and clinical literature evidence of pathological lying, yet the zeitgeist appeared to move away from that after the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then has seemingly been revamped or reinterested, and Chris and I have been interested to look back into this and try to synthesize all this. And so that's what we're going to present on one aspect of that today. And here's a quote from, this quote here is from, I believe, Chris Hart. Now, in all honesty, it's not Chris Hart, but this is a case study from Goganini and Newmark, 2014, from a 17-year-old male individual who was determined to have pseudologia fantastica. So Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, so the project Drew and I have been working on, one of the issues we're dealing with is trying to figure out who are these pathological liars, kind of what are the traits that define them, and then also maybe a little information about prevalence, how common are they? And so the project we're going to talk about today was part of our attempt to identify or to try to identify whether or not there's a distinct group of pathological liars. So this is the data from Kim Sirota and his colleagues, and what they show is you see this pattern in the self-reported deception where most people report being fairly honest, but then there's this small subset of people who tend to lie prolifically. And I think that they reported that 5% of the people in their studies were telling about 50% of the lies, and they've done a little bit more nuanced research like that they published this year that shows that there's some variability across days. But anyway, this was kind of the impetus for our thinking about whether we could use frequency of lying as well as some other factors to identify who pathological liars were. And as Drew mentioned, pathological lying has been studied for about 130 years, and in that time, I think like 17 unique definitions have been offered up. But it turns out there's only really one common theme that seems to run through all those definitions, and that is the people lie prolifically. And so we've tried to identify other ways of conceptualizing pathological lying. And one of the ways that we gravitated toward was conceptualizing pathological lying in the same way that we conceptualize other mental disorders like mood disorders and anxiety disorders. We don't just look at the frequency of the behavior. We also look at dysfunction that it causes in people's lives. We look at distress and pain that it causes in their lives. And then we look at kind of risk or danger that it poses, sometimes to their lives, sometimes to their livelihoods. And so that was the approach that we took with pathological lying. Sure, you want to skip to the next slide. There you go. And so we published a study 2 years ago in which we wanted to examine whether pathological liars actually do exhibit higher frequency of lying, dysfunction in their lives, distress, and some sort of risk or danger of harm to themselves or others. And so we collected data from over 800 people, and we intentionally went to a sampling selection procedure where we thought we might maximize the number of pathological liars we were able to pull in. Because again, we were expecting this might be a relatively small subset. So we went to a number of sites where people were talking about lying, people were talking about mental disorders and so forth. And so we collected a bunch of data, and you can see the demographics there. Or you want to click ahead. And what we found was that indeed, let me step back. One of the things we did was we asked people to self-report whether they believed themselves to be pathological liars or whether anyone in their lives had suggested they were pathological liars. Obviously, self-report is, carries a lot of problems, and anyone who studies lying behavior knows about that. But anyway, that was our starting point. What we found was that those people who self-identified as pathological liars or for whom other people had identified them as pathological liars, we found that indeed they did have higher frequency of lying. We measured frequency a few different ways. One was chronicity. These people reported having a problem with lying for over 6 months. They reported telling 5 or more lies per day. The average was 9. Obviously, we're looking at possibly skewed data. And then we found that that represented about 8 to 13% of the population, depending on how we were defining it. And again, that population value might seem high, but keep in mind we were selecting from a sampling pool of people where we thought pathological liars would likely be overrepresented. We also found that those people who identified as pathological liars had impaired functioning across several life domains, including their personal lives, their work lives, so forth. They experienced increased levels of distress, and they gave numerous indications of the lying actually putting themselves at risk or danger. And so based on the work that we did there, we developed a definition of pathological lying that we felt conceptualized pathological lying in the same manner that other psychological and psychiatric conditions are conceptualized. And so this is the definition we came up with. And so basically the persistent, pervasive pattern of lying that's been kind of the common theme through definitions of pathological lying for over a century. But then we also included in that some of the other features, the compulsive lying, the impaired function, the distress, and so forth. And so one of the issues is, or questions that we're grappling with is not only like what are pathological liars, but also trying to get some sense of the prevalence. Looking at prevalence is really hard because the data that have been collected so far have been in heavily biased samples. And so one of the first ones from over 100 years ago, Healy and Healy, they found it was 20% of their sample was pathological liars. However, the data were collected in a juvenile detention facility, so obviously that makes sense. And then in our recent work, we found it was like 8 to 13%, but again, we're collecting from a biased sample as well.
And so one of the things we're interested in presenting here was based off some of the excellent reviewers' feedback on some of our work, Pathological Lying, with the forthcoming book we have, was to re-examine some of the data by using a cluster analysis or some kind of factor analysis. So what we did is conducted a cluster analysis with the question of can these self-identified pathological liars be grouped statistically from the non-pathological liars? So outside of self-identification, could we find this grouping statistically? So what we did was a 2-step and k-means cluster analyses to determine if pathological lying could group up based on those 4F criteria. So we converted the frequency of lies, the functioning, distress, and danger. We converted all these into z-scores and then ran our cluster analyses. So first was the 2-step cluster analysis. And from this, we found about 72 participants fell in, well, we found broadly 2 clusters, and that it was a good model for these 2 clusters. So they clustered into 2 groups pretty well, and identified approximately 72 identified 72 participants into that pathological lying group. And then we ran a k-means cluster and found, based on the 2 clusters, and found this grouping here, that across total lies, function, distress, and danger, these all represented a distinct group in which there were a higher number of lies told, greater impairment in functioning, greater distress, greater danger to those who were in the pathological lying condition compared to those who were not. And so the specific ANOVAs are here for each of these areas in which there was part of that model. Each of these variables, frequency, function, feeling pain, and fatal, were significant and significantly predicted the group membership for those cluster analyses. And so from our initial study, we found 8 to 13%, and that variation or range in percent was the 13% was the self-identification. The 8%, the more conservative estimate there, was something we found from the distress questionnaire. It was a screener of distress, and it has a sensitivity and specificity cutoff. With the specificity cutoff, the higher cutoff of 14, that's where we came up with the smaller prevalence of 8%. The current work here, the cluster analysis, essentially confirms that 13%. So that self-identification of pathological liars appears to be the same grouping statistically from our cluster analyses. And so our cluster analyses appear to validate the self-reports of pathological lying. The distress criteria offers a little more conservative estimate. And some of the recent work that Chris has been leading, that I've been helping out with, is on the development of the pathological lying inventory, which has been presented to some of the individuals here for the Deception Research Society. And that has found a smaller prevalence of about 5% with a cutoff of 4 on that pathological lying inventory. So one of the limitations, as Chris mentioned, we were going at this data to look for specifically a sample of pathological liars. So we recruited from psych forums and places where there's people who profess psychopathology. So inherent with that, or one of the potential limitations, is this prevalence may be inflated, not representing the general population collectively, because we were specifically looking for that group. So the estimates, we're trying to look for maybe that more conservative number of 8%, or even our recent research indicating maybe around 5%. So we appreciate you listening, and hopefully your interest in pathological lying. And we have a book forthcoming with some of this information in there as well, coming out in November. So thank you all.